And joining us now in the studio to discuss next week's budget and the negotiations over the carbon tax is the President of the Business Council of Australia, Graham Bradley. Thanks for being here.
Good evening.
Now, do you agree with Greg Hunt that the Prime Minister's Kirribilli House dinner with business leaders is sending the wrong message to taxpayers?
Well, actually, no. I think it's a very good thing that the Prime Minister is reaching out to the chief executives of companies that are going to be most affected by her carbon pricing proposals, as far as we understand at the moment, and getting from the horse's mouth the real impact that will have on their companies, their jobs, their employees.
I don't want to belabour this, but the implication from the coalition seems to be that while rich businessmen are sitting around eating lobster dinners, poor Australians out there are suffering under the burden, or will be suffering under the burden of a carbon tax. It's inappropriate, according to them, for the dinner to even take place, evidently.
Well, I think it's important that the dialogue take place, Tony, regardless of its circumstance.
OK. On the issue they're talking about, there's some confusion over whether or not the BCA supports the government's approach to carbon pricing. Do you support it or not?
Well, what is it, to start with? I mean, that's our problem at the moment, where the government's announced a general direction, but none of the details on which businesses, whether they're individual businesses or the council itself, can come to grips with what the real implications of this are for the Australian economy, for our future competitive position. And in fact, we can't even assess whether it's going to have the kind of impact on carbon emissions that the government says it might.
You do support, or it's written that you do, a market-based approach to reining in carbon emissions. Is that correct?
Yes, that's been a consistent policy by the Business Council in order to achieve the lowest cost approach for the overall economy and therefore do the least damage to the competitiveness of our industry. A market-based mechanism is obviously part of what is needed, but we've also always said that this is such a big problem, it's such a big transition for our economy, that we need a multitude of approaches to this.
Do you accept the rationale that the proposed carbon tax is a transitional step towards that market-based mechanism and a necessary one?
Well, whether it's necessary and the timing, that's a matter of yet to be debated, and it depends on the size of the price of the tax and how long that transition will be, and the details which we still don't have.
Let's just leave aside the details which we don't know for the moment. What about the principle of beginning with a carbon tax to set a carbon price and then move subsequently to a market-based mechanism that you actually want?
Well, that in theory is not a bad approach, but for this point. We're in a very different environment today than we were 3 years ago when this approach of an emissions trading scheme was first proposed and we had the proper green paper on it. We're in a different environment for a number of reasons. Firstly, we don't have the international binding agreement into which our carbon approach is going to fit, and therefore we can't adjudge how much that will impact Australian industry. Secondly, our economy is still recovering from a global financial crisis, and it's a very patchy recovery. Some sectors are doing well, but some are not, and that should be taken into account by the government, including the very high Australian dollar that's a consequence of our current commodities price boom.
But in principle, you don't oppose a carbon tax as a preliminary or transitional step towards a market-based mechanism?
A properly designed approach to this carbon emissions scheme with a market-based mechanism would be favoured by business.
But a carbon tax is what we're talking about, because this is the controversial thing. I mean, it's a carbon tax for 4 or 5 years leading to a market-based mechanism. In principle, if the figures are right, you'd agree with that, would you?